Hello and welcome to this week's painting video. We're going to a bit of a change of pace this time with our next artist, who is Joseph Mylord William Turner, 1775 to 1851. He's probably one of the greats of the English landscape tradition. But, you know, I think probably that question could be asked as why we should look at someone like Turner. And my answer to that is, I think it's his sustained study is an example that he sets of observation of the world around him. Hand in hand with his engagement with his materials, his willingness to push the boundaries of what was possible, and that internal willingness to experiment with anything that he touched, be it watercolour, oil, even his pencil sketches and his sketchings changed and were a constant evolving exploration of the world around him. Also, I think it's his willingness to use techniques from any of those mediums and then using them in, so take for example his use of watercolour, and then he's using some of those techniques in his oil paintings, and then back again the other way, oil techniques, using them in watercolour. The exercises that we're going to start with are basic introductions to some of the concepts behind Turner's working methods. So they're not necessarily the be-all and end-all of how he worked, but it starts to introduce you to the way he used colour and tone, and the methods that he constantly started to use as approaches to his work. So often his works are started with very similar beginnings, but then would go out into different ends, so to speak. So we're looking principally at those beginnings. I would encourage you probably to stay very closely to the examples that we're going to paint in this week's exercise. Bearing in mind too that I'll be using oils for these exercises, but you can be doing them with watercolour or acrylic as well. There's no real reason why you couldn't do it in any of the techniques. And it could be interesting too to try maybe them in oil and in watercolour as well, particularly the last two panels that we'll do on the sheets that I've got prepared. So let's get going. So I'm going to be working in oils for this exercise, but you can equally be working in acrylic or watercolour for these. Probably the primary difference will be that if you're working in watercolour, it's important to remember some of those lifting techniques that we have done in the watercolour video, where I'll be using white as a way of introducing light into, or introducing lightness into some of these exercises that I do. That's where you would be introducing some of the methods of lifting colour off the paper with watercolour. Mind you, there are still, with some of the techniques that we're going to be doing here with oil, which again you could be doing with acrylic, that we're wiping away back to the white of our surface. What I've done here is this is just canvas paper that I have taped down, but before I taped it down, I have given it a coat of acrylic primer or gesso, just so that the paper isn't quite as absorbent as it normally would be. And that means for some of these techniques that we're going to get certain effects like what you see in Turner's work. So the first thing we're going to do, and this relates to the other video from this week where we're doing scale practice, is the contrast of tone. So we're just going to fill in this first area here, and all we're going to do is in 1/2 of the block of the rectangle, we're going to paint that in like so with black, leaving a white space blank. And in the corresponding white section, we're going to paint a square of black. What this is demonstrating is the contrast of tone and how powerful that contrast can be, either a little bit of dark within a large area of light, or vice versa, a little bit of light within a dark space. We can further enhance that contrast when we introduce colour. And what I want you to do in the next square is that we're going, or rectangle I should say, is that I'm going to paint in with cobalt blue, a similar proportion to what I did with the black, leaving a space left over, and then painting a small square of blue in a darker tone like that. And then we're going to introduce, and here I'm using Cad Red Light, no sorry, Cad Red Medium. And we're going to just thin it out ever so slightly, just using a little bit of solvent. And filling that space with a little bit of red. Now what we're demonstrating here is that we're following through with this idea of dark and light, and the light with a little bit of dark and the dark with a little bit of light. But we're introducing the concept of colour and its temperature. We're using just the basic idea that one half of the colour wheel advances and the other half of the colour wheel recedes. And those advancing side of the colour wheel, we often talk about those as the warmer colours, oranges, yellows, reds, etc., as opposed to the cooler side of the colour wheel, the greens, the blues, the violets. So here you can see we've got this light red and this darker toned blue, but we're also using the fact that the little bit of warmth within the cool space and the little bit of cool within the warm area. Now this is a key concept that Turner followed through with in his work, in that he would use warms within cools and cools within warms to create interest. In our next here, we're going to introduce one of the two spaces or beginnings that Turner would use, and that is a cool sky with a warm landmass. So in this case we're going to come back to cobalt blue, and we're going to use plenty of solvent in our mix there, and we're going to just run that roughly across like that. And then the same thing below, with this time yellow ochre. And again, we're using the solvent like water in watercolour. And leave it. What I then want you to do is repeat that in this next square. This time maybe with a little bit more solvent so that it's thinner. I might just put some down and then further thin it out with solvent. And then again repeat that yellow ochre down in the bottom. And this time we're going to just then push that a little bit further. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce with not as much solvent, and maybe touch it with a little bit of Prussian blue as well, is that into that sky we're going to charge it as we were talking about with watercolour. The thing with watercolour is that you're able to do some of these marks with just a single sweep. When you start to deal here with oils or acrylics, sometimes you've got to be tickling those colours around a little bit more.
and introduce those stronger blues into a few areas to create some variation. So here we're almost dealing with that idea of what we've got up here, that into a light tone we're adding in some darks, and down the bottom we're going to do the same thing here again too, is into that light yellow ochre. We'll charge that, and this is just a bit of burnt umber. And charge that with some dark. Like so. You can, if you're feeling some of, particularly if you're working in oils, we can start to even wipe out and soften. With a cloth, like so. On another sheet that I've prepared exactly the same way as the previous one, we're now going to do the opposite to what we just did. So in this case, we're going to thin out the yellow ochre, and paint a band of that. With a thinned out band of blue. So this is sort of a typical beginning, whereas the other one before was sort of a very typical clear blue over land. This is more like a sunset over water that you see in a lot of typical Turner works. Remembering these are some of the possibilities of some of his beginnings. Again, repeat that same exercise. This time I'm going to do it slightly more scratchy. Maybe not with quite as much. And then with that cool band underneath. This time we're going to follow through with that idea now of strengthening those two areas by introducing a stronger blue and a stronger red, which I'm going to use that Cad Red light, Cad Red medium I should say. Whoops, it's very strong. So there's another possibility. In this next exercise, we're actually going to repeat what we've just done here. So starting with that yellow sky, I'm going to start in those corners and take some of the paint off my brush and then drag that, thinning it down as we get closer. So we've got those stronger areas like that in those corners. That blue, take some of the paint out of my brush and drag it around so that it looks a little more washy. Then we're going to put those stronger colours into the water and the sky. And then some of that cad red into that sky. So I started with some very weak cad red and I'm just then introducing some stronger dashes. So what you can see, it's almost behaving like it would in a watercolour. Is because of the yellow ochre being down there and acting like a wash, there's areas of the red now that are bleeding and charging around, and we can, by manipulating it with the brush, have a little bit of control over what's going on there. I think we'll leave that there like that. The next thing we're going to do is that we're going to add, so it's all about adding contrasts when it comes to Turner's, the basics of Turner's working methods. Just going to charge that. This is Prussian blue that I added it before, but it's gone a bit weak. I reckon we could go a bit stronger. Ooh. That's better. Much better. It's all about adding in contrast. So another contrast that we can do is that we can start to cool the warm. So here we've added these. So if we start with that Cad Red medium and add into it just a little bit of the cobalt blue, that it starts to cool, and so starts to go to like a violet. And we can add another strata of darker clouds into this. Like so. With that same mix is that we can then also start to introduce a land mass in along that horizon line, like so. Actually might make that with a bit more heavier paint. Like so. If any of this looks any bit heavy at any stage, is that either if you're working in watercolour whilst it's still wet, maybe lift those clouds, or even with a brush you can start to, if you're working in oils or acrylics, start to just dry brush those out a little bit. So I'm more than anything here just a little bit of pushing around, but lifting with the brush some of those marks that maybe look a little heavy. And softening some of those edges out. Sometimes if you want is, as I said, either we'll be introducing white as a light, but even just to do with the tip of the brush, we'll lift out an area. So you could be doing this in the watercolour by lifting out a light either with tape that. That'll do. Fiddling. Then with that same colour, as I said, I'm just going to come in with maybe a smaller or something with a little bit more of a ability to do detail, and introduce some mooring posts. If we're thinking of some of Turner's Venetian themes. And even some possibly architecturally or something going along on that mass. And even the beginnings of a boat or something in that section there. Our next element that we're going to introduce into this one is where we will introduce using white. Now if you were doing this with watercolour, is that you'd be lifting this, but we're going to do it with oil, and we're doing it by introducing some white paint the sun, and a reflection. In the water. Now I'm using that quite thickly and impastoed so that it's not blending with what's underneath. It's these blobs being put down. You could also introduce some other light details into some of these other areas. If you so choose. And we might just put so there's number one. The next one we're going to think about, and another classic motif that Turner would use is his castles on hills, in mists, etc. So to help you as a bit of a guide is that we're going to think a tower on a hillside. So we're going to draw that into just as a silhouette on our page, like so. And the first step we're going to do is, if you're working in watercolour, do this with water, of course. But if you're going to be working in oil, is I'm going to just use some solvent, and I'm going to cover the whole thing with just fresh solvent. Now, this is looking a little bit dirty because my solvent's a bit dirty. It's starting to pick up there the graphite as well, but that doesn't matter. We're just covering the whole thing with solvent. Into that, we're going to start with our yellow ochre. And we're going to have it nice and strong up in that corner and weakening it out. And we're going to work our way across the whole surface. Over in this side, we're going to just strengthen that back up again. Don't worry if you go over the line and into the sky, we're just coming up with an environment to begin with. Whilst that's still wet, we're going to come in there with a bit of burnt umber, and we're going to strengthen some of our land masses here with some dark. We might even come in with a little bit of light red too. Oh, that is strong. It's probably nicer. And a little bit over in there as well. Tickle that around. Now if you're working in watercolour, I would then dry that with the hairdryer and let that well and truly dry. If you're working with oils, you will probably just have to let that stage dry and let what happens, which could take maybe half an hour, maybe more, and go from there. Now, because I accidentally didn't press record, I missed the next stages. So what I have now done here is that I've just repeated to an extent what I did in that last panel, but this time on a piece of canvas that's been attached to some MDF. So it's just been glued down with PVA and then gessoed with acrylic gesso, which I'll talk more about probably in Zoom as a way of preparing some boards for you to do some of your Turner exercises. But to move on, our next stage with this exercise is now to introduce some cool. So this is a sort of a typical Turner beginning in that he would define and create an atmosphere or a space with all warm colours, and then define those warm colours and the shapes of those warm colours with a cool. So we're going to turn this board around. And using cobalt blue, we're going to work our way from that line and out. Like so. Now whilst that's still wet, we're going to charge into this with some areas of stronger blue, starting to maybe think about creating some cloud type sort of shapes. And a bit more of a stronger blue. Up in that section too. Then mix a strong, cool, dark. So starting with cobalt blue, and add into it just a little bit of that light red so that it's like the nice violety colour, but dark. And what we're going to do is we're just going to paint a foreground mass like this with stronger paint to begin with, just to define those edges. And then add into it some solvent. And so pull that out and get it nice and scratchy down towards the base here. Now if there's areas that you think you've still got too much dark in there, is just with a cloth. You can wipe some of those areas away, creating some interesting lights like that. The final thing we're going to do, and this is what you would normally do in watercolour, you'd be lifting colour out, but in this case we're introducing it, like I said earlier, because I'm using oil, by painting in with white and quite opaquely, is that we're going to introduce some light onto that towel like that. So we've got that strong light. What you can further do is just then drag just a bit of that light across some areas like that. That's a bit strong. Mind you, that's quite nice. You might also wish to put a little bit of that white. Now remember, it's going to blend quite considerably. But into that sky as well. If it gets a little strong, it's just with a clean, fresh brush. Just tickle the edges out. Like so. Oh, I could fiddle all day. Okay, so there you go. A little bit different to how I started it, but that's again introducing some basic Turner principles. Good luck with those. Whether you're working in watercolour, oil, acrylic, it doesn't matter. But if you have any troubles, please just shoot me an email, and I'm more than happy to give you some advice. And we'll talk more about what's going on these panels when I meet you in Zoom. Take care, and speak to you soon.